Good, I can hand it off to you.
Welcome, everyone, and Happy New Year. I'm Stephen Bartkus, the Executive Director of the Ridgefield Historical Society. We are so excited that it is now 2026, and you all know what that means. It's the 250th birthday of America.
Remember America?
The Ridgefield Historical Society has a lot of great things in store for 2026, and we hope that you will join us for this once-in-a-lifetime commemoration. And tonight's presentation is part of it. It kicks it all off. God Save the King, Loyalism in Ridgefield, Connecticut during the American Revolution, with Keith Marshall Jones III. Please join our email list if you'd like to stay up to date about our latest coming up that we have planned. I'd like to thank our friends here at St. Stephen's Church for allowing us to use this space for tonight. And of course, our friends at Books on the Common who are selling copies of Keith's new book at the back of the room this evening. To our members in attendance, thank you so much for your continuing support. If you're not yet a member of the Ridgefield Historical Society, I invite you to join our organization and help us do the important work that we do to preserve Ridgefield's history. Go to ridgefieldhistoricalsociety.org to make a donation, become a member, or become a volunteer of our organization. I'd like to mention two upcoming items before we get started tonight. On Wednesday, January 21st at 7:30 p.m., there is a very important town vote taking place at Veterans Park School here in Ridgefield. And this is for the East Ridge Historic District. The Ridgefield Historical Society has been working very hard for months with the Ridgefield Historic District Commission to create this new historic district. It will add critical protection to an area that figured prominently in the earliest history of the town, and we strongly encourage all Ridgefield residents to attend the meeting and vote in favor of this new district. On Sunday, January 25th at 2 o'clock at Lounsbury House, Melanie Beal Marks will give a presentation titled Faces from the Past, a History Mystery that Connects a Family to Ridgefield. 6 incredible 19th century portraits of Ridgefield residents that were recently discovered will be on display in an exhibit at Lounsbury House, and Melanie will open a window into Ridgefield's family history and this revolutionary past that has been untold for 2 centuries. So this is the second program in our 250th commemoration activities, so please join us for that. So for tonight, I'm honored to introduce Keith Marshall Jones III. He is the founding president of the Ridgefield Historical Society, so we owe everything to him. We would not exist without Keith.
Gene.
Keith serves as a member of the advisory committee for our National Park Service Battle of Ridgefield Archaeology Project. And our archaeologists have been making many interesting discoveries over this past year related to the battle, and you'll be hearing more about that in 2026. Keith is the author of the new book, God Save the King, Loyalism in Ridgefield, Connecticut during the American Revolution, 1765 to 1786, copies which are available for purchase this evening and signing by Keith. He's also the author of other books, including The Battle of Ridgefield, Benedict, Arnold, the Patriot, Militia, and the surprising 1777 battle that galvanized revolutionary Connecticut, which was published in 2024. Also, John Lawrence, the Immigrant, Founding Father, America Never Knew, which was awarded the American Philosophical Society's 2019 Publication of the Year. Also, Congress as My Government, Chief Justice John Marshall in the War for Independence. Also, Farmers Against the Crown, and The Farms of Farmingville. Keith is also a descendant of the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, John Marshall, and Keith lives in New York City and Connecticut. Please join me in warmly welcoming Keith back to Ridgefield.
Thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, thank everyone for coming. I was away for 20 years and came back to Connecticut, and this town is magic as it always has been. A different kind of magic we're going to talk about tonight. 2 other people I'd like to thank. Whitney Altop, are you here from St. Stephen's? the rector of St. Stephen's, which was the hotbed of liberalism in this part of Connecticut for a while. We'll touch on that too. Also, Jack Sanders. Everybody knows Jack. When I didn't set out to write this book, it came up in a session of the 250th anniversary committee meeting that James Segelstein of the Historical Society is holding, that we'd left out the Loyalists and somebody ought to look into it. So okay, I'll do that. I thought, this is one thing I'll be Jack Sanders to, because he's written about everything else. So I called him and said, Jack, would you kindly take a look at my manuscript? And he said, yes, I would. And by the way, I've got a whole file of Loyalists that I've been accumulating to write about this, and you can have it. So I owe Jack double thanks, one for the editing, and secondly, for the head start he gave me of his Loyalist files. So with those gratitudes behind us, let's move on to this guy. Wouldn't it be nice to be a king? Well, we may find out. Anyway, Loyalists during the Revolution, what comes to your mind? Most of you probably will think about somebody in Boston who had a wig and a satin waistcoat and who was a rich merchant and loyal to the king. And that story does not apply. In this part of inland Fairfield County, the Loyalists were farmers, tradesmen, people with all of their money tied up in their land, no different from who turned out to be the Patriots, and who pledged their allegiance to the king. They prayed for the king's health at church, both in the Episcopal and in the Congregational church. They toasted the king in the tavern that used to be where the library is now. They fought alongside the king's troops during the war with the French and came out victorious. And their loyalty was not to England, their loyalty was to the person of the king, who happened to be George. Now, who would embody that relationship better than our old friend John Adams? 6 weeks before bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, John Adams would write in the local newspaper, "We owe allegiance to the person of His Majesty King George III, whom God preserve, but our allegiance to His Majesty is not due by virtue of any act of Parliament, but by our own charter." It was that charter, as well as Connecticut's charter, that gave us all the land that we owned fee simple, where other provinces of the king's domain owned their land with put rents or with lord grants or in proprietorships. Big difference. We owed our charter to King George, and that's where our loyalty lay before blood was fought. And owing that charter came from this guy, Giovanni Cabato. Who knows Giovanni Cabato? Huh? This is an Italian community in many sense. You got to know Giovanni Cabato. Better known as John Cabot, who in 1497 landed in Newfoundland and claimed the entire continent of North America for the person of the king, not for Great Britain, hadn't been formed yet, not for England, but for the personal property of the King of England. A century later, not quite a century later, Sir Edward Coke, Chief Justice of the British Judiciary, ruled that all persons born within any territory in the actual possession of the king, and that was North America, are subjects of the king. No one can renounce the duty of allegiance permanently established by birth. That's the principle of jus soli. Your citizenship is by birth, and the 14th Amendment of our Constitution embeds that very same principle. You are a citizen of where you were born. So Ridgefielders, by being born here, were allegiant to the crown, and they could not divorce themselves from that according to British law. Now, some goodies came along with being a British subject. You had a Bill of Rights from 1689 that was the basis of our current Bill of Rights in our Constitution. You were guaranteed free speech in Parliament, freedom from unlawful imprisonment, trial by jury, right to petition the king, own property, and Protestants were given the right to bear arms. Papists, not so much. You were given the right to only pay taxes levied by Parliament. You were not guaranteed taxation with representation. That was made up. That was manufactured by James Otis and the Boston community. All England was giving its subject was the right to only pay taxes levied by Parliament, not by the king. So that was the lay of the land back when we arrived to the end of the French of the Indian War. And King George personally owned what you see here, starting with the Hudson Bay Colony in Upper Canada, which was chartered as a freestanding colony for commercial purposes, moving over to Nova Scotia, which had driven the French out of Acadia and was a prize of the French and Indian War. Over to the left, the province of Quebec was now a British province. You see from Maine all the way down to Georgia, those were the king's personal provinces if you read the letter of the law. Of course, he'd given the land away and by charter, so he didn't have primary ownership, but he was still lurking in the background, able to revoke any charter at his own will. And you see a red line at the end. That was a proclamation running from Georgia all the way up to Maine of 1763, in which Parliament forbid colonists from crossing into the land of the Native Americans. We all know that as protecting the Native American allies of the king, but if you read the smaller print down below in the proclamation, it says that no transactions from the Native Americans shall be done except through a British king's land agent. So part of the reason was to get a cut of all the land purchases going on in Native American territory. This was King George's domain, and we were happy to have it after the end of the French and Indian War. But all colonies were not the same. There were three kinds: royal colonies, proprietorships, and then, like Connecticut, corporate colonies. As you see there in blue, Virginia, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, those were once corporate colonies like Connecticut. The king was upset and revoked their charters and made them into royal provinces, which he governed through his own royal governors. Proprietary, the Penn family in Pennsylvania, the Calvert family, Lord Baltimore in Maryland, were given the land from the king and acted as lords of the land. Only Connecticut and Rhode Island had corporate charters, which meant two things. One, the right to govern yourself entirely, and two, the right to disperse of the land without the king's permission. Gigantic benefits for Connecticut. Well, contrast Connecticut as a corporate colony with Massachusetts as a province. Elected governor of our own, the British was appointed by the crown. Our judges were our own. We had no vice admiralty court. We had no indirect trade we traded through New York and Boston, not directly with England. The direct trade with Britain set up a merchant class in Boston who were really worried about the taxes that we had less to concern ourselves with. We had no British troops stationed in the state. There were no quit rents. Most of the other colonies had quit rents, which was a carryover from the days when the lord had vassals and in return for their military service and some payments gave them tenure that evolved into an annual rent called a quit rent in order to have permanent possession. We never had those in Connecticut. We had no tea ships, no stamp ships. So you can see the liberties that we enjoyed that the other colonies would go to war to be able to have, that we already had. So now going forward, I'm going to talk about four things. One, the unique nature of Connecticut's dual loyalty to its own charter of liberty and the king to whom we owed allegiance. The town meeting that turned us into a Tory town on January 30th, 1775. And I've uncovered a lot of things that really surprised me here. And we're actually going to relive that meeting. I'm going to present all the different arguments and you can decide how you would vote. Then we'll go into who were the Ridgefield Loyalists. I identified 56 specific people in my book. That's probably about half of the number who really were Loyalists, who just weren't outed. And then what were the consequences of that loyalty to Ridgefielders? And we'll take question on all four parts at the end for the sake of time. Okay. We in Connecticut were both the king's subjects in a global empire, and we were free men of a secular republic. That secular republic took place because Connecticut Colony created itself. From Boston, groups of dissatisfied Puritans simply set up shop in Wethersfield, Windsor, and in Hartford. With no grant from anyone, they created their very own constitution, the Fundamental Orders, America's First, and they put in writing that their sovereignty rested with the people and not King George. Well, or any king at that time. And because there was a civil war going on in England, England wasn't paying a lot of attention. And so our colony began on its own, independent of anyone. It was based on 3 pillars. The Fundamental Orders of 1639, there were a written constitution, the Code of 1650 that said all land sales within Connecticut Colony were fee simple. Now, you go to the Ridgefield records and you'll see that our land tracts, and yours too, reads fee simple. From the very beginning, that meant they were absolute, perpetual, transferable, and no attached fees of any kind, as opposed to quit rents or other payments to lords with bushels of corn or whatever. Of course, at this time, they're still by themselves, operating in 1650. The king has got other things on his mind. And they knew that they had better get a charter from the king eventually before he found the game was up. And so in 1662, we got the sweetheart deal of the century, the Charter for Connecticut Colony. Well, the Fundamental Orders very quickly combined church and state, the Congregational Church. We elected our governor, our magistrates, our judges, and freemen did the voting for all of that. Each town was a congregation of the Congregational Church, and there was no mention of the English crown whatsoever in the charter. Only 3 things were asked. Can you guess what they were? 1, we had to try to Christianize the Native Americans. That was a condition of the charter. No problem. They were dying from malaria and everything else anyway. 2, 1/5 of all gold and silver in the colony would go to the king. Again, no problem. There really wasn't gold and silver in the colony. Okay. And the 3rd, we could not create legislation that violated laws of Parliament. Other than that, this Fundamental Orders had a free ride. The Charter of 1662, as I mentioned, gave all rights to the soil to the governor and company for the benefit of the freemen. This is Connecticut Colony's charter, which meant everybody was elected and none were appointed by the British Crown. We were also given the Western Reserve. All the way to the Pacific Ocean from the western side of Connecticut was in the charter for Connecticut. And the authority to charter towns without the king's permission. I mean, this is the sweetheart deal of all time that Connecticut and Rhode Island have, and Connecticut made the most of it, as you might guess. So imagine this now, you are a free man in Connecticut, and you decided to come to Ridgefield. Well, 25 proprietors were given charter by the colony in Hartford. The Congregational Church was mandated, as in all towns of Connecticut, mandated, and town meetings were mandated of the freemen, and the freemen were people who had 40 pounds of property cluttered by debt. Only they could vote. There were about 1 man out of 9 in Connecticut Colony. In Ridgefield, 1 man out of 2, because everybody came here to be a farmer for the most part. So this was really a town governed by its own landowners. We had 2 reps in the General Assembly, but other than that, we're a republic pretty much within a republic. So you can imagine, as time went by, Ridgefielders, with all the benefits of being a British subject, all of the rights of an Englishman, and all the benefits of the Charter of Connecticut of 1662, wanted to preserve that charter. And what helped them reach those decisions was Reverend Ingersoll of the Congregational Church. 40 years in the pulpit, went to war in the French and Indian War and fought with the troops, and basically believed in moderation. His younger brother was the colony attorney sent to London to deal with the Stamp Act. And the input from his brother was that moderation. These are reasonable people, If we don't provoke them, we can maintain our charter, and we can also get what we want from a merchant standpoint. The Church of England came to Ridgefield, as it did in Fairfield County. Up to 30% of churchgoers in Fairfield County were Church of England by 1770. We think about a quarter of churchgoers in Ridgefield went to St. Stephen's. And as you know, the liturgy of the Church of England blessed King George with morning prayer every day and saw King George as the head of the church. So if you went to the Episcopal Church in Ridgefield, you leaned toward the crown. We traded with New York, not Boston. All of this Tea Party stuff and these taxes, that was Boston's problem. New York was friends of the king, and New York money was more valuable than Massachusetts money anyway when we did any currency transfers. We had no Sons of Liberty mobs in Ridgefield. The Stamp Act was not of much importance to farmers this deep into the countryside. I mean, we didn't, taxes on playing cards, who needed it? Taxes on legal papers, who needed it? So amazingly to find that when you had Sons of Liberty, mobs and correspondence communities on the coastal towns of Fairfield County and throughout the west of Connecticut, not in Ridgefield, and for the most part, not in Danbury, Newtown, Reading, or New Fairfield either. But the real deal breaker for leaning toward the crown in our dual loyalties was the Susquehanna Company. How many of you have heard of the Susquehanna Company? Okay, well, you know it was formed in 1753 by the moneyed part of Connecticut. That's the Connecticut River guys, along with the eastern part of Connecticut, who formed a company to buy that Western Reserve land. Remember all that land? It was 5 times the size of the acreage of Connecticut at that time. Big money was to be made. Who stood against it? The King of England. Remember the red line on the map? You couldn't cross the line. The Susquehanna Company was betting big time on buying land across the line. Now, why would that bother people in Ridgefield? Well, figure it out. If all your money was tied up in your own farm, and suddenly farmland at half the price was available only 100 miles away, your young people would leave, and the value of your own property would go down big time. What protected that from happening? Parliament and the Proclamation of 1763. So for all of these reasons, Ridgefielders tended to lean toward the crown in their dual loyalty. Okay. In 1771, I didn't know this, it's in our town meeting records though, and again in 1772, we petitioned to separate from the rest of Fairfield County to make a separate county. We were joined by these other towns. Politically, economically, and even church-wise, we were separate from the Fairfield County coastal towns and the rest of Connecticut. We had heavy Church of England, we had farmers, not merchants, and we had an affinity for the crown that was stronger than other parts of the country, or excuse me, the colony. Dual loyalty, though, came to an end after the Boston Tea Party. The First Continental Congress met and issued an order for, or a recommendation, shall I say, for a boycott of all British goods. Why? The Intolerable Acts had shut down British commerce in Boston, had suspended the Massachusetts and colonial legislature, had suspended town meetings, and pretty much had all but revoked Massachusetts charter. Wouldn't Connecticut be next, was the thinking? So, all of the towns in Connecticut, 72 towns, had to make a decision. Would they support Continental Congress, or would they stay with King George and defy a Continental Congress? So our meeting was on January 30th in the Congregational Church, which at that time served as the town hall, and put towards the freemen of the town of Ridgefield, over 200 of them, was the question whether this town will adopt and confirm to the resolves contained in ye association of the Continental Congress. If we went for a Congress, that was pretty much defying King George. If we went for King George, that was telling the Congress to stuff it. There were 5 arguments. All we have of a record of this meeting in our town records is that was mature deliberation. So I fleshed out what were the arguments that could have been made, and I'll summarize each one of them. And you imagine yourself as a freeman of Ridgefield with your dual loyalty and having decided which side you're going to come out on. Will you be pro-Congress? Will you be pro-Congregational Church? Will you go with the Episcopal Church? Will you go with the anti-Congress argument, or will you follow reliable Reverend Jared Ingersoll's advice? So let's start with the passionate guys, the pro-Congress boycott. They would tell you, freemen, if Massachusetts colony's charter can be suspended, so can ours, and all those liberties we have, gone. It could happen next month. And if the T-tax stands, well, won't other taxes follow? And if you remember, when we boycotted from the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, England caved. So let's stand strong with our fellow colonies and vote for the boycott. Our governor is for it. Our General Assembly is for it. Our delegates to the Continental Association are for it. We should vote for the boycott. The Congregational Church would say, and this is from a printed document issued by the Western Association of Congregational Churchmen that was distributed throughout Fairfield County. It was printed in New Haven, so it may have gone throughout the colony. They said the next step will be vacating all grants and patents of land from the king. That means your farm. All landed property will then revert to His Majesty if we don't proceed with this boycott. Show hearty concurrence with other parts of the continent in the cause of American liberty. This was the position of the Congregational Church. The Episcopal Church had a different point of view. King George is the supreme governor of the Church of England. The Book of Prayer proclaims him anointed representative of God. St. Paul, Romans 13:1-7, entreats civil obedience to authority ordained by God. You have no choice, my fellow townsmen, but to reject this congressional boycott. Then came the anti-boycott argument. My fellow freemen, Congress has no constitutional authority. Those are just a group of 100 people who met in Philadelphia. We have a charter. We're subject of King George. Congress has no authority. And besides, our land values are protected by Great Britain, not by Continental Congress. It's Great Britain that's enforcing the emancipation line that keeps our property values up. And our rights as Englishmen, you want a right to trial by jury? You want a right to be able to pay taxes only levied by Parliament? You won't get that from Congress. You only get that from King George. Finally, our precious charter forbids violating acts of Congress. It was one of the conditions of the charter. If you believe in rule of law, if you believe in protecting the value of the land, you have to vote against this congressional boycott. Now, Reverend Ingersoll was probably at this meeting because he was a freeman of the town, and the meeting was for all freemen. For 40 years, he'd grown up with the Ridgefield landowners. He'd educated most of their children. He'd taught them the route to an honorable life. And he would say, and these are his words, not at this meeting, but from other writings, that calmness in time of passion is what we must preserve. Nothing can harm us but our own violence. Moderation and compromise will solve this issue. My brother tells me from London, we've got many friends in Parliament who support the colonies. In fact, we have our own representative. We have a seat. Connecticut had a seat in Parliament. Our agent, Richard Jackson, MP, had a seat in Parliament, and he owned 700 acres in Connecticut. He was essentially a Connecticut freeman. He was a paid agent who spoke for us in Parliament. Isaac Barre was another who spoke for us. They had 41 other delegates to the floor of the Parliament who were in favor. Give them time. Give them time. They'll present argument. Submit to lawful authority in the meantime in what is good and right. So after hearing all those arguments, the town freemen published a 5-point statement that says, "We do acknowledge His Most Sacred Majesty King George III to be our rightful sovereign, and we do hereby publicly disapprove and protest against said Congress and the measures by them as unconstitutional." So spoke some 200 Ridgefield freemen against 9 who objected and voted for the boycott. The story, of course, didn't end there. It began. The aftermath. In Ridgebury, 55 Liberty men protested violently, put out a petition of their own, and sent it to not only the General Assembly, but other towns in Fairfield County, and initially inviting them to come in and fix this situation. The General Assembly on February 20th ordered an investigation of Newtown and Ridgefield, who had both voted for favor of King George. The freemen decided they better take another look. On March 7th, they met and they could decide nothing except to meet again on April 10th, in which they met again and they decided nothing. Lexington and Concord came and went. The Battle of Bunker Hill came and went. Ridgefield had not yet disavowed King George and sided with Congress. On December 14th, the General Assembly came out with an act to restrain and punish inimical persons, essentially Tories, and I'll get into the details of the ugly details of that later. December 8th and 15th, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis of Stratford, who was second in command of the 4th Connecticut Militia, took 200 troops and disarmed Newtown, Danbury, Reading, and Ridgefield Tories. This has been hidden virtually entirely from our history. The only way you find out this took place is some receipts that are in Connecticut archives in Hartford for expenses incurred by Lewis, Hamilton Hurd's History of Connecticut, and the Rich archives in Canada, who detail this. The towns who were affected make no mention of it. All we know about Ridgefield is that shortly afterwards, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Burr Bradley, who was one of our representatives to the General Assembly, who was a 4-time selectman and who was a sitting justice of the peace, was made moderator of a Newtown meeting, which unanimously voted in favor of Congress. They elected Patriot selectmen for the upcoming year and created a committee of inspection, whose job it was, according to the Continental Association, to investigate any complaint against anyone who might be labeled as inimical, i.e. Tory. Okay, our own ice is sweeping into town. So who were the loyalists who were affected? Well, 20% of the whole United Colonies is my take. Some go higher, some go lower. But Paul Smith's investigation in the William and Mary Quarterly of about 30 years ago, I think, is the best. He lays it at 20%, but only 10% in Connecticut. Up to 2,000 of them fled to Long Island, which was British, but 25% of Fairfield County was by eyewitnesses termed as loyalists. 75% of members of the Church of England, 50% of Newtown and Reading, and my estimate is 25% in Ridgefield. Now, how did you know someone was a Tory? The act I mentioned in late 1775 by the Connecticut General Assembly said Tories were 3 things. 1, they supplied materials and intelligence to the enemy. They served, or they encouraged others to serve, or they piloted vessels. That was actively participating. 2, if you wrote or spoke to defame the resolves of Congress or the General Assembly, you were branded an inimical, a loyalist. Or 3, and this is really bothersome. If anyone reported you to the local authorities as inimical, you were investigated. Your house was broken into, your mail was read. If you drank tea, that was criminal. If you harbored a friend who was a proven loyalist, then you too were a loyalist. Now, there's no record of this. The Committee of Inspection for Ridgefield, like all of the other ones, kept no written record. The record's not in the town meetings because this work was not done by town meeting. It was done by the Patriot Committee of Inspection, who was going door to door and answering, responding to, he's a loyalist, she's a loyalist. Not a pretty time. In Ridgefield, I identified 50 men and 6 men that we could say with some degree of certainty were loyalists. There were probably another 50 who kept it to themselves or quietly went along without stirring up the waves. They were farmers, they were tradesmen, they were not uppity, upper class merchants. It ran in the family. 60% of the loyalists I found came from 6 families, and these were Ridgefield's oldest founding families. The Burts, our first blacksmiths, Benjamin's Burt's family. Sherwood, our first miller's family. The Smith family, there were 4 Smiths out of the 25 original proprietors. The Stebbins family. Stebbins was our first tanner brought in when the town was founded. The Wilson family, one of the very first proprietors was a Wilson. And most of these attended St. Stephen's Church. We don't know individually, but we know their families did. Even the Patriot families, Olmsted, Keeler, and Northrop, rock-hard Patriot families, had loyalists in the family. It tore the town, you can only imagine, 1,700 people going to 2 churches, intermarried, families divided up. Of the Smiths, there were 14 we know were proven patriots, and there were 12 we know that were loyalists. I identified 10 of them and tell their stories in the book. The effect on the town, you can only imagine. 11 Ridgefield men bore arms in a King's regiment. What you see here is the Prince of Wales American Volunteers. Most of them were in this unit. There is good reason to believe at least 5 of those Ridgefield men left town before Tryon's raid of 1777 and were on the roster of the British regiment wearing these green uniforms who came back to town and fired on their own countrymen during the Battle of Ridgefield. One of them was Josiah Stebbins, Benjamin Stebbins' grandson, who was given a commission as a lieutenant if he could get a company of men. He couldn't. He tried during the Battle of Ridgefield and left empty-handed. His commission was not fulfilled. 22 others of the 56 absconded to British New York and did not bear arms. 23, however, remained passive in Ridgefield throughout the war. And by remaining passive meant you took an oath, and you can see this cartoon of oath-taking in America with your stereotype Tory there, the wigged one with the full dress. You see lurking in the background a scaffold balancing a bag of feathers with a barrel of pine tar. But let's move on now. We know who the loyalists were. What was the price they paid in Ridgefield? Retribution began with George Washington. During the siege of Boston, he sent letters to the governors of Connecticut and Rhode Island asking to seize on those Tories. Why should persons who are preying on the vitals of their country be suffered to stalk at large? Jonathan Trumbull, governor of Connecticut, was brother Jonathan, was Washington's fast friends, and he moved immediately. The 1775 Act I told you about, within a month of getting this letter from Washington, the offenses were, if you were directly or indirectly aided the ministerial forces, as I mentioned earlier, your punishment, you lost your estate and could go to jail for up to 3 years if they caught you. If you spoke to defame or wrote to defame Congress or the General Assembly, you lost your franchise. That was the ability to vote in a time. You were disarmed, you were asked to post bond for good behavior, or you were possibly imprisoned. If you were reported as a local to the authorities, you were observed and required to take an oath. And if you refused the oath, well, Continental Congress early in 1776 passed the Tory Acts, which meant enlighten these uninformed persons. They just would come to our side if they only knew the facts. Committees of safety were to disarm the notoriously disaffected. It wasn't throw Tories in jail, it was disarm the notoriously disaffected. And bring authorities, and this was due process, and it was the case in Connecticut. You went for examination and trial before the Connecticut Superior Court in Fairfield or in Hartford before you were punished. The courts were inundated in Connecticut. Our 6 county jails were filled. Our 11 overflow jails were filled. The horrendous Newgate prison in Simsbury for the hardened criminals was overflowing. We sent up internment camps. I never knew about this. Bolton, Coventry, Lebanon, Mansfield, New Canaan. Individual homes were parole centers for loyalists not found to be dangerous who were exported there from other towns until they repented. And they paid for the room and board while they were there, or were billed anyway. The Sons of Liberty mobs did justice of their own. Anglican ministers were dragged off to jail. Epinetus Townsend, who was the minister of St. Stephen's, was taken by the freemen of Fishkill, New York, and imprisoned there in house custody for nearly a year before sneaking in a few sermons and going to British Long Island. Leeming, the reverend of the Anglican Church in Norwalk, was dragged from his home and thrown in jail. Most of the other Anglican ministers left. Loyalists were outed, publicly shamed, dragged in the streets by the mobs. They were hosted on liberty poles. I always thought liberty poles were there to make a statement. They were there to hang Tories from, and leave them there hanging suspended until they'd had enough. And in some cases, they were tarred and feathered. Now, the tar and feathering was more threat than reality. The American Battlefield Trust could only find 70 individuals by name over this 10-year period in all of the colonies who were actually tarred and feathered. I found 3 in Connecticut from 1765 through the end of the war, only 3, and none in Fairfield County. So all this tar and feathering that we hear about was more of a threat than a reality. But people who were tarred with pine tar, not road asphalt, of course, were scarred for life. In Ridgefield, the Committee of Inspection swung into action in April 1776. You'll recognize these names: Douchy, Hoyt, Sherwood, Smith, Stebbins, Wilson. They were all hauled from their homes, taken under guard to house custody in Bolton until they signed an oath and posted bond. Stebbins's bond is the one we have on record of 300 pounds, Connecticut pounds. In December, another 7 faced the same treatment from Ridgefield, taken from their homes, sent to Bolton. These people were also mentioned by name in the Connecticut newspapers. They were publicly shamed by the Connecticut inspection of Ridgefield as enemies of the people that were desiring no persons to have dealings with them. So even when they came back from posting their bond, they came back to a community that was told to shun them. 1775 was only the beginning of the anti-Tory laws. I mentioned the Act to Restrain and Punish Inimicals. In 1776, another loyalty oath was required. What was that? Declaration of Independence. Connecticut was a state. Now, you took your oath to the state of Connecticut. You could be confined or removed with other laws, disenfranchised, and if you were guilty of treason, punishable by death. But only one person that we know of was punished by death from a civil court. In the military, there were others. In 1777, after Tryon's raid, Loyalists were prohibited to travel from town to town without written permission. They were forbidden to buy or sell property. Personal property, not their land, but personal property was confiscated. And then Governor Trumbull offered full pardon. Any loyalist who would repent and come back and pay their bills was given full pardon. I didn't find anybody in Ridgefield who did. When you think about it, the public shunning that you would have to face may have been intolerable, but it was there. In 1779, the legislature moved to confiscate the land in addition to the property of confirmed loyalists. Not so much because they wanted the money, it was that the debtors of those loyalists wanted to collect the money, and the person they collect from had absconded, so their only choice and recourse was to sell the property and be paid off. In 1780, one final swat, and that is, if you were a parent of a son who joined the British forces, you were to pay a fee of the cost it would take to enlist a soldier in the Continental Army. So the ones that stayed behind and never were loyalists themselves, if one of their sons was one of those 11 who went to war, you ended up with that. 19 Ridgefield estates were confiscated. The usual names: Sherwood, Stebbins, Wilson, Morehouse, Smith, a couple of Keelers. Their land was confiscated and either sold or leased by the state, all through due process. There are court cases that substantiate each one of these, and you can find them in a couple of boxes buried underground virtually in Hartford, where the Connecticut archives are. I went through boxes of 867 individual property judgments to sort out the ones that came from Ridgefield, but they're there. Finally, in 1783, the war comes to the end. And what did the Loyalists get from the settlement from the British Crown? That the colonies would earnestly recommend restitution of confiscated property. Not restore it, earnestly recommend. And of course, that fell flat. But they did say no future confiscations and anyone under confinement would be set free. But Connecticut towns were slow to welcome people back. Stamford, Norwalk, Stratford, Fairfield all had committees appointed to turn away anyone who was coming back to town as a repentant loyalist. Ridgefield was remarkably lenient. In 1779, we passed in town meeting only a regulation that you could only return with the express permission of the Committee of Inspection. So you weren't forbidden, you just had to have individual approval. Although we don't see anybody really being approved until 1786, 3 years afterwards. What we all don't know is that the Crown took care of its own. King George ordered that restitution be given to those who could prove that they had lost property. 50,000 loyalists fled to Canada, followed by another wave in 1790 of another 30,000, unrelated really to the war, but maybe not. King George promised them restitution. He promised them 100 to 500 acres of land in Newfoundland. He promised them transportation there. He promised them clothing, tools, and food until they got on their feet. Only about half of the people who submitted for all of that actually reimbursed, and they were only reimbursed for about 50% of what their losses claimed to be. 4 million English pounds, that's you're into the billions, $2 billion today, went to this relocation. During the winter when they were starving, the troops' flour supplies in Halifax were given to the Loyalists in order to bake. Approximately 20% of Canadian citizens after the war had ended were Americans. The judicial system of Canada changed from French law to to British law because of these Americans. These people are treated proudly there. They were given the designation UEL to put after their name, which would be like PhD here. It's not much used today because it's kind of a pretentious statement and time has passed, but they were singled out for special attention and they were given another 100 acres of land or 200 acres if they would relocate to Ontario. It sounds better than it was for a lot of people. There was not enough to go around. There were elites. The people who lived there resented the Loyalists coming in and getting all of this handout, and many came back. But the Crown tried to take care of its own. Of our 56 known Loyalists, 23 never left, 33 left, 16 returned. Of those 16, 8 couldn't take it when they got back and relocated elsewhere, either in New York or up close to the Canadian border. 11 of them removed to Canada and 2 removed elsewhere. I'll close by naming 4 specific Loyalists and telling a little bit of their story, because together that kind of adds up for a feel of what our Loyalists went through. We start with Rachel Benedict, a Ridgefield girl. The Benedicts were one of the firmest Patriot families. She married a Loyalist in Pound Ridge who joined the British Army in 1777 after his brother was beaten and the house was seized. She delivered her 4th child before her house was taken. She finally went to Long Island. They went to Nova Scotia in 1783 and never returned. And her son Benjamin is still honored by the United Empire Loyalist Society of Canada for fathering 13 children. The ones who fathered the most children got recognition up there. George Follett, he was a sergeant in the French and Indian War, not in the British Army, but with colonial folks. He married Thankful Burt. They had 7 children. In 1776, he went to British Long Island and supplied intelligence as part of Tryon's network to the British, and he distributed counterfeit currency. He was caught and jailed as a dangerous person, posted bond, swore oath, was released a year later, and remained in Ridgefield the rest of his life. Benjamin Burt, he's brother-in-law of George Follett, because he married Rebecca Follett. He was in the Queen's Rangers in 1777. His property was taken in 1779. He sailed to Nova Scotia in 1783, where he died 2 years later. His wife and 8 children never returned. Josiah Stebbins. He's the only officer from Ridgefield to serve during the French and Indian War. He rose from the rank of private to sergeant to lieutenant. He was offered offers in the Continental Army, and he refused them. He was among the Bolton 14. He signed the oath. He returned to Ridgefield. His business was ruined. He couldn't make a living. He fled to the British in 1776, but he came back as part of Tryon's raid the next year to recruit a company of the provincial troops. There's more. His property was confiscated in 1779, and he went to Nova Scotia briefly, where he claimed, under the King's program, 900 pounds in loss, and was actually granted 600 pounds. He returned to Ridgefield. His only son disowned him and changed his name back to his mother's maiden name. He recovered some of his outstanding debts from people who owed him money, and then he died in peacefully, we suppose, in Ridgefield. He remarried a rich widow, as it turned out, to help ease his pains back in town. So you can only wonder what his social life was like, having gone through a third wife, abandoning his second wife, who was a Burr, one of the blue blood names of Fairfield, and his only son disowned him. Well, that real quickly is a whole lot of history of the Loyalist story in Ridgefield. I think what you can say, though, is our treatment was moderate. Reverend Trumbull had set a standard of civic behavior among the Congregationalists, and we didn't have mobs. We had no tar and featherings. We may have had a pole hoisting. I couldn't find reason of it. We did let people back in town. Some property was restored. Of the comparative towns throughout Connecticut, I think Ridgefield was relatively civil and lenient in the way that we treated our Loyalists before the Revolution. And by 1767, it was all over, and everybody was back to Ridgefield's real business, which was selling land. So with that, any questions, please? No, that's all. Yes, sir.
So, before I moved to Ridgefield a couple of years ago, I lived in North Salem for 33 years, and there are a lot of similar family names in North Salem as you have in Ridgefield. Keeler,
right? Yeah,
and a bunch of others. Were they Loyalists, or because they're in a different company?
I don't know. This my research is microhistory at its best. It is simply the town of Ridgefield Loyalists and what happened to them. My guess is what happened in Ridgefield, right across the border, New York legislation took place too, that many of the same stories probably were there. But I'll ask that question. I'm addressing the North Salem Historical Society later this month, and that's a good question. I'll bring it up with them, see what they can tell me.
You also had more Dutch in North Salem, which you didn't have here.
More guts. Well, the families in the church, you didn't have the Congregational Church in North Salem, and you did have the Episcopal Church, but I don't know how extensive the membership was. But we do know there were an awful lot of Salem men who fought at the Battle of Ridgefield alongside the Connecticut men during that action. But I really don't know that much about the North Salem Loyalists. Thank you. Piqued my interest. Yes, sir.
In April of 1777, when the Battle of Ridgefield occurred, do you know approximately how many people lived in town, and what was the breakdown between loyalists, and what was the aftermath like?
We could only guess. There were 1,708. The population was 1,708. The best estimates is generally 1 out of 4 men, but women, nobody counted for women. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own property. There's no record of my trying to identify loyalist women was really difficult, because just because you were married to a loyalist didn't mean that you were automatically a loyalist yourself. So no, there were maybe 8 houses on Main Street. What I do know, and I found this out after my Battle of Ridgefield book and while I was doing this, is that many Ridgefielders gave refreshments to the king's troops while he was here, and that people were appointed as guardsmen by the town selectmen to guard the houses and watch the houses of those who were observed. We know that at least 5 men were hired and paid by the state of Connecticut to watch houses of loyalists in the aftermath of the Battle of Ridgefield, and they were paid all the way through December of the following year. So there were still loyalists in Ridgefield afterwards. Now, a number of them left with Tryon. That was another thing I discovered in this book. Of those 11 who fled to go to bear British arms, half of them followed Tryon. Scores of loyalists in Tryon's raid then went over to Long Island because pretty much the game was up here. It was pretty clear that he was not going to save them, and that Connecticut was Patriot country. Yes, sir.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, I thought in the book, I was interested in that lady that was on Long Island and kind of ratting out the people that were inimicals. And
wonderful question. How many of you went to the lecture here, maybe it was a couple months ago, that the gentleman is referring to, where a historian from Long Island was probing what really went on in what was one of the most patriot families in Long Island, the Townsend family. Well, as it turns out, Reverend Epenetus Townsend of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church was from that family. And if you go to their family records to try and to investigate him, all you will ever find is simply his name, his date of birth, and the fact that he perished. He died with his family at sea, accompanying a British regiment as chaplain to Nova Scotia. And so I found that connection to the Townsend family, who covered up their slavery as well as they covered up their loyalists. But almost impossible to find these people in these patriot families, but they were there. As in the loyalist families, there were many who were as strongly in favor of Continental Congress as their brethren who were against. And the gentleman in front of you?
Yeah, in what you described as that town meeting in Ridgefield, where the loyalists sort of
right for the vote.
Ridgefield was kind of an island in a sea of revolutionaries.
You're absolutely right.
But there's a lot more of Connecticut that's not on the coast. Were there other towns that suffered the same?
There were a heavier incidence of loyalists in western Litchfield County, for sure. On the eastern part of the Connecticut River, no. They were isolated and they were treated, forcefully early on. Along the Connecticut River towns were people who would waver. And the thing about a loyalist is today's loyalists could be tomorrow's patriot, depending on which army was in town at that point in time. And loyalists did repent. Some legitimately, like Ezekiel Wilson here of the family, he saw that he was in the wrong, and he reverted back to the patriot cause and really participated during the rest of the war to help it. So some who were loyalists in one year became converted patriots in the next year. And after the Declaration of Independence, the incidence of loyalists then, of course, began to decline because it was either leave or have your property taken or be shunned. But yes, Western Connecticut had some too, yeah. The only man who was hung, Moses Dunbar in Waterbury, was from outside of Fairfield County. But Fairfield County was the hotbed, and inland Fairfield County was the epicenter. Welcome to Ridgefield. In the back, yes.
Well, how influential it was on basically creating loyalists. What kind of pamphlet or literature were loyalists reading here that was different than in Boston or
The literature and the reading.
like
What would somebody in Ridgefield have come across in terms of literature to inform their decision? Well, there were only 4 newspapers in the state, and the New York press was pretty heavily pro-Crown. The 4 Patriot newspapers, New Haven and Hartford, were the closest one. How did a newspaper get from there to here? If anyone was educated in college, it was only Philip Burr Bradley, who was Yale, and then the 2 reverends who were college educated. You're talking about farmers with a 6th grade education who were taught to read and read the Bible thoroughly every Sunday. They got pamphlets from the church. We know the Congregational Church sent out pamphlets. The Episcopal Church sent out pamphlets. There must have been things from the Committee of Inspection that we just don't have records of. But for the most part, they would have relied upon the leaders of their community that they trusted, which were the reverends and the senior military. What? Yes, ma'am.
I hadn't thought about this before watching Ken Burns right now and stuff. How many of these people, nobody was born in England, right? They were all born here? Or were any immigrated from there and had real British roots, or they most of them were born here?
You're talking 1775.
Right.
Okay, Connecticut Colony formed in 1638.
Right, they were here.
So
Okay.
the 25 proprietors, I researched, every one of them came from, if not one of the Connecticut colonies, from New York. So the ones that came here were subjects of the crown, and then all their children were automatically subjects of the crown. Yeah. And anywhere that the king had planted his flag, you were automatically a subject of the crown. If you were then born there, you were given the rights of an Englishman. How are we doing on time, Stephen? Are we, okay. Right back here. Yes.
Well, to her point, it's hard for us to remember, but they would have self-identified as Englishmen and women. You know, the concept of, and then maybe a nutmegger or a Massachusetts, that was secondary. But for so many of them, they identified as English subjects of King George.
Yeah. But it's hard for us to grapple one with the idea of a king and pledging allegiance to a king. That's something in my mind will never, no matter who wants to be king, will ever grapple with that. But that's a hard thing for us to deal with. And secondly, is that the King of England was the best of kings. The rights of Englishmen, Frenchmen didn't have, Spanish didn't have, Portuguese didn't have, Russian, no one else had. And there was rule of law. There were real courts that tried to induce rule of law. So as your point, as we moved toward the Stamp Act, everyone virtually was proud to be an Englishman as well as a freeman of Connecticut. And it was only the having to pay for the war and all the taxes that came from it began to raise questions that, hey, shouldn't we be independent? And of course, the majority felt that way. And again, 100% loyalist in 1763, 100%. 1783, 0%. Okay, so it kind of is, where along that timeline are you going to say, are you a loyalist or not? And I don't know if there's an answer to that question. Well, what I do know is there's an excellent football game going on now between Miami and Mississippi that some people may want to see. So we'll wrap this up now, and we do have books in the back if you want to go deeper into this chapter of Ridgefield history. Other words, first of all, I have to tell you, this was not the 252nd meeting of the Ridgefield Loyalist Society for any taping that's going on. And that, of course, we made the right decision. Independence was what this continent was meant for, but you still have to have some sense of respect for the honor of those who stayed with the allegiance that they had initially given. And it's a chapter that we don't have to be ashamed of. There was some nobility here, and there was fair treatment, and there was judicial process along with the atrocities. And it had a fairly happy ending for those who survived. So thank you again.
Thank you.